The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The air was thick with anticipation as the judge prepared to deliver her ruling. Every breath, every movement seemed amplified in the silence. The defendant sat rigid, his fingers gripping the edge of the table, his lawyer leaning forward as if bracing for impact. The prosecutor wore a look of quiet confidence, sure that victory was moments away. Then, just as the judge parted her lips to speak, a voice cut through the heavy stillness. "Your Honor, I have something to say." A ripple of gasps shot through the room. Heads turned sharply toward the back of the courtroom, where a young woman had risen from her seat. Her hands trembled at her sides, but her voice, though unsteady, held a conviction that couldn't be ignored. The judge's eyes snapped to the woman, her expression hardening. "Excuse me?" The bailiff, already moving, rushed toward her. "Sit down, miss, or you'll be removed from the courtroom." But the woman didn't flinch. She took a step forward, her gaze fixed on the defendant. Her voice rose above the murmur of the crowd, unwavering now. "You don't have the full truth." The gavel slammed against the wooden block, sharp and demanding. The judge's voice rang out, commanding, "Enough! Sit down or I will hold you in contempt." But the woman stood her ground. The tension in the room transformed into a charged current, everyone waiting for what would happen next. The defendant, who had been motionless moments ago, slowly turned his head toward her, his expression unreadable. For the first time since the trial began, the balance of power in the room had shifted, and nobody knew what was about to happen next. The judge's gaze bore into the young woman standing defiantly in the middle of the courtroom. Her grip tightened on the gavel, her patience clearly thinning. "Who exactly are you?" she demanded, her voice sharp and unwavering. A deep breath, a flicker of hesitation. Then the woman lifted her chin, her voice ringing through the courtroom with quiet intensity. "My name is Emily Carter, and I know something that can change everything." The room, already tense, fell into an eerie silence, the kind that stretched too long, making every second feel like an eternity. The rustling of papers ceased, the murmurs died, and for a brief moment it was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Every pair of eyes locked onto Emily, the weight of her words settling like a dense fog. At the defense table, Mark Bennett, once slumped under the weight of his own trial, stiffened. His face, already pale, lost what little color it had left. His eyes, filled with something between shock and desperation, met Emily's. A silent plea passed between them, his head shaking ever so slightly. Don't do this." His lawyer sat frozen, his hands resting on the table, unsure whether to intervene or let this moment play out. The judge's expression remained unreadable, though the curiosity in her eyes was impossible to ignore. She leaned forward slightly, one finger tapping against the bench, a habit she had when weighing a difficult decision. "You have 5 seconds," she warned, her voice now quieter but laced with authority. 5 seconds to explain why this court should listen to you." Emily swallowed hard, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could feel the eyes of the jury, the attorneys, the strangers in the gallery, all waiting for her next words. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. The weight of the moment pressed against Emily's chest, but she refused to falter. With steady hands, she pointed toward the stack of documents on the prosecutor's table. "The emails," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "They're fake." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The prosecutor shot up from his seat, his face darkening with frustration. "Objection," he barked. "This woman is not a witness. She has no standing to speak in this courtroom." The judge held up a hand, silencing him without so much as a glance in his direction. Her piercing gaze remained locked on Emily. "Explain yourself," she ordered, her voice now lower, more deliberate. Emily nodded, her breath coming quicker now, but her words remained steady. The emails presented as evidence, the ones supposedly sent by Mark Bennett, they contain a mistake. A tiny, almost imperceptible mistake, but one that changes everything. The prosecutor scoffed loudly, shaking his head as if the very notion was absurd. "Your Honor, this is—" "Quiet." The judge's sharp command cut through the room like a blade. "Let her finish." Emily took a small, grounding breath before continuing. "The sender's email address," she said, pointing at the document. "It's wrong, off by just one letter. It's the kind of detail that most people wouldn't notice, but I did." The judge's expression shifted, the skeptical glint in her eyes giving way to something else, something sharper: interest. Emily saw it happen, the precise moment the judge realized this wasn't just some desperate plea from an outsider. This was something worth listening to. "It's a subtle mistake," Emily continued, her voice gaining strength. "But it proves these emails were fabricated because the real Mark Bennett never sent them." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, hushed but frantic. The jury exchanged glances. The bailiff, usually stoic, subtly adjusted his stance. Even the defendant himself, previously hunched in despair, now sat up straighter, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. The judge leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in thought. For the first time since Emily had spoken, she wasn't just hearing her, she was listening. The judge's stare bore into Emily, her expression unreadable. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air, the murmurs of the courtroom fading into a suffocating silence. "If you're serious," the judge finally said, her voice slow and deliberate, "take the stand and testify under oath." Emily's breath caught. This wasn't part of the plan. She had expected resistance, had braced herself for skepticism, but she hadn't thought she would end up here, standing at the very center of a legal battle she had no business being a part of. Her feet felt frozen in place, her heart hammering in her chest. This was the moment, the line between merely speaking up and truly stepping into the fire. Then, she caught sight of Mark Bennett, the man who had spent the entire trial weighed down by hopelessness, his shoulders slumped as if crushed beneath an invisible force. But now his eyes were locked on her, not pleading, not resisting, just watching, waiting. Emily swallowed hard, then took a step forward. "I'll do it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as she moved toward the witness stand. The bailiff stepped forward, the weight of the moment pressing down with every step she took. "Raise your right hand," he instructed. Emily's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted her hand. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" For a split second she hesitated, because the truth was dangerous. But she had already come this far. "I swear," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The judge nodded. "Proceed." Emily drew in a breath, ready to speak. But before a single word could leave her lips, the courtroom doors burst open with a deafening bang. Gasps erupted as every head snapped toward the entrance. A man in a dark suit rushed inside, his breath labored as if he had been running. He clutched a folder tightly in one hand, his face pale with urgency. "Your Honor," he called out, his voice edged with desperation. The room stood still. The judge narrowed her eyes. "Who are you, and why are you interrupting my courtroom?" The man swallowed hard, stepping forward. "My name is Robert Hayes. I'm an investigator," he said, holding up the folder for all to see. "And I have evidence that will change everything." The tension in the courtroom thickened as Robert Hayes stepped forward, still catching his breath. His suit was slightly disheveled, his tie loosened as if he had been running to get here. But his grip on the folder was firm, his eyes sharp with purpose. "Your Honor," he repeated, his voice carrying a weight that demanded attention. "Mark Bennett is being framed." A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery, hushed but urgent. The judge's gaze remained locked on Robert, her fingers tapping against the bench in slow deliberation. The prosecutor, however, let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Framed?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "Your Honor, this is absurd. First, we have an unsworn civilian interrupting court proceedings, and now we have some so-called investigator making wild accusations." Robert didn't flinch. He stepped closer, lifting the folder for emphasis. "This isn't speculation. This is evidence. There's a network operating behind the scenes, moving money through offshore accounts, manipulating financial records, and setting up Mark Bennett as their scapegoat." The room buzzed with quiet shock. Even the jury, who had been instructed to remain impartial, couldn't hide their interest. The prosecutor rolled his eyes, arms crossed. "This is a circus," he muttered. "Your Honor, the defense is clearly grasping at straws." But the judge wasn't looking at him anymore. Her eyes remained on Robert, scanning him for any sign of deception. She had spent years on the bench, had seen every trick in the book. But something about this man's urgency told her that he believed every word he was saying. She exhaled sharply, rubbing her temple. Then her voice came down, firm and decisive. "Mr. Hayes, hand over that folder." The prosecutor's mouth opened as if to object, but one glance from the judge silenced him. Robert stepped forward, carefully placing the folder onto the bench. The judge flipped it open, scanning the first few pages. Her eyes narrowed, her brow furrowing deeper with every document she read. The entire courtroom held its breath. No one spoke. No one dared to move. After a long pause, the judge exhaled through her nose and sat back in her chair. "This court is now in recess for 30 minutes, she announced. "I will review this evidence before making any further rulings." The gavel slammed down, but instead of dispersing, the courtroom erupted into hushed whispers. Emily, still in the witness stand, felt her pulse hammering in her throat. She had stepped forward to tell the truth, but now it was clear. This went far beyond her. And whatever was inside that folder, it was about to change everything. The courtroom remained suspended in an uneasy silence as the judge flipped through the pages of the folder. The rustle of paper was the only sound in the vast chamber, each turn more deliberate than the last. Her frown deepened, her sharp eyes scanning every detail with an intensity that made the air feel even heavier. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming against the table. The confidence he carried just moments ago now seemed forced, his jaw tightening with each second that passed. Then, without warning, the judge slammed the folder shut. The crack of the impact echoed through the room, making several people flinch. The prosecutor's head snapped up, but before he could say a word, the judge turned her gaze toward him, cold and unforgiving. "This is significant," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom, growing louder by the second. People leaned toward one another, trying to decipher the meaning behind her words. The defendant, Mark Bennett, gripped the edge of the table, his breath shallow, his eyes darting between the judge and Robert Hayes. Emily felt her heart pounding. Whatever was in that folder, it wasn't just a minor discrepancy, it was something big. The judge exhaled slowly, steepling her fingers in front of her. Then, her eyes locked onto Robert. "Explain," she ordered. Robert stepped forward, his voice steady, unwavering. "Your Honor, these documents expose a financial trail leading to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, an account that was not set up by Mark Bennett." The prosecutor let out a sharp breath, his irritation returning. "And who exactly did set up this account?" Robert's gaze never wavered. "William Grant," he said. The reaction was instant. A wave of gasps rolled through the room, the name sending a shock through everyone present. The judge's expression remained unreadable, but her grip on the bench tightened. The prosecutor, however, only scoffed. "William Grant, a board member of the very charity Mark Bennett supposedly stole from? That's ridiculous. No, Robert countered, his voice sharp, cutting through the noise. What's ridiculous is that he's been siphoning money for years. The transactions show that before this alleged theft, large sums of charity funds were being funneled into a shell company connected to Grant. The judge turned back to the folder, flipping through it again, this time with new understanding. The evidence wasn't just a theory, it was hard proof. Robert continued, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. Grant didn't just frame Mark, he used him as a shield. And when things got too close, he fabricated those emails to pin the entire crime on him. But Grant made one mistake. He thought no one would look this closely. The prosecutor sat motionless, lips pressed into a thin line. He knew what this meant. The case he had been so confident in was now falling apart. The judge leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow exhale. The weight of the moment settled over the courtroom. And suddenly, for the first time in weeks, Mark Bennett wasn't the man on trial anymore. The silence that followed Robert's revelation was deafening. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension, every person frozen in place as the weight of the accusations settled over them. The judge's grip on the bench remained firm, her face unreadable. Then the prosecutor shot to his feet. "This is nothing but a distraction," he barked, his voice laced with frustration. "A desperate attempt to derail this trial with baseless accusations." The judge's gaze flicked to him, her expression cool, composed. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. "Sit down." The words weren't loud, but they cut through the air like a blade. The prosecutor hesitated, his lips pressed into a thin line, his fists clenched at his sides. But there was no arguing with that tone, not in this courtroom. Slowly, stiffly, he sank back into his chair. The damage, however, had already been done. His outburst only solidified what everyone was already thinking. This wasn't just some wild theory. This was real. And it was unraveling before their eyes. The judge straightened, tapping her fingers against the bench in thought. Then, she exhaled sharply. "This court will reconvene tomorrow morning," she announced. "I expect both the prosecution and the defense to be prepared to discuss the implications of this new evidence." The gavel slammed down, and just like that, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Emily barely heard the murmurs, the scrambling of journalists, or even the defendant's lawyer whispering urgently to Mark Bennett. Her mind was spinning, her body humming with adrenaline. She had done what she came here to do. She had spoken the truth. But as she stepped out into the cool night air, a strange feeling settled over her. Someone was watching her. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it, the unmistakable weight of unseen eyes pressing against her back. Her steps quickened as she moved through the courthouse parking lot, her pulse drumming in her ears. By the time she reached her car, her hands were shaking. She forced herself to take a steadying breath. It's just your imagination. But later that night, as she sat in her dimly lit apartment, her phone buzzed on the table. A single text message. "Stay out of this if you know what's good for you." The breath caught in her throat. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the phone, reading the words again, as if somehow they would change. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest. A sharp, instinctive fear crawled up her spine. She rushed to the window and yanked back the curtain. There, across the street, beneath the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, a car sat parked in the shadows. Inside, a dark figure sat motionless, watching. Emily's breath hitched. She stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't coincidence. Someone wanted her to stop, and they were willing to make sure she got the message. Emily barely slept that night. The text message played on repeat in her mind. The shadowed figure in the car still burned into her vision every time she closed her eyes. Whoever had sent that warning wasn't bluffing. They wanted her to stop, needed her to stop. But it was too late for that. By sunrise, she was already in Robert's office, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she had barely touched. Robert was hunched over his laptop, scrolling through a stream of code and encrypted files, his expression unreadable. Then, a pause. A slow exhale. And then he turned the screen toward her. Got it. Emily leaned in, eyes scanning the text on the screen. A chain of emails, private, encrypted, buried deep in a secure server belonging to Silverton Solutions, one of the companies tied to Grant's offshore accounts. She didn't need to be a tech expert to recognize the smoking gun sitting in front of her. One email, sent just days before Mark's trial began. Ensure Grant takes the fall if necessary. The charity's reputation must remain intact. Nash will handle the details. Emily's stomach turned. There it was. Proof that Grant was never supposed to survive this scandal. If things got messy, he was nothing more than a disposable pawn. She met Robert's eyes. We take this to the judge, now. There was no argument, no hesitation. They grabbed the evidence and rushed to the courthouse. By the time they pushed through the courtroom doors, the trial had already resumed. The judge was seated, the prosecutor standing at his table, mid-sentence. And with no further credible evidence, we request that the court move forward with the— Your Honor. Robert's voice rang sharp and clear through the courtroom. Heads turned. The room shifted as he strode forward, the folder clutched tightly in his hands. The judge narrowed her eyes. Mr. Hayes, unless you have something of immediate relevance— I do, Robert cut in. He moved straight to the bench, holding out the folder. This is evidence directly tied to the conspiracy against Mark Bennett. The judge hesitated for only a second before motioning for the bailiff. The folder was handed up. As she flipped through the contents, her expression shifted. First confusion, then disbelief, then fury. When she finally looked up, her voice was ice. This trial is now under federal investigation. The courtroom exploded, gasps, shouting, chaos. Mark Bennett turned to his lawyer, his expression a mixture of shock and hope. The prosecutor, his face pale as death, immediately jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The defense is pulling last-minute tactics to delay. Sit down, Mr. Caldwell. The judge's voice cut through the noise, and the prosecutor froze. The room wasn't done shaking. A sharp, sudden gasp from the defense table. All eyes turned, just in time to see William Grant clutching his chest, his face contorted, his body seizing up. He slumped forward, his fingers clawing at his shirt as his breath came in short, ragged gasps. The courtroom descended into panic. Call an ambulance! Someone shouted. The judge slammed the gavel, trying to restore order, but it was useless. Paramedics rushed in. Emily stood frozen, her mind racing. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had just silenced William Grant. The courtroom erupted into chaos as paramedics rushed in, pushing through the stunned crowd. The gavel slammed down repeatedly, but the judge's efforts to restore order were drowned out by the frantic voices filling the room. William Grant's body convulsed as he gasped for air, his hands still clutched at his chest. His skin had turned an unnatural shade of gray, his veins standing out like thin, dark lines. Whatever was happening to him, it wasn't just stress. Emily stood frozen, watching as the paramedics worked swiftly, laying him on a stretcher. The sight should have shocked her, should have filled her with confusion. But all she felt was cold certainty. Robert leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. They tried to silence him. Emily's breath caught. She turned to him, but his expression was unreadable, his eyes locked on Grant's weakening body. The judge, having finally restored order, rose from her seat. Her face, once a mask of measured authority, now burned with something else entirely, fury. She turned to the bailiff. I want every hospital record, toxicology report, and medical evaluation on William Grant. If there is even the slightest trace of foul play, this entire case will shift focus. The prosecutor shot up from his seat. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We can't halt a trial based on conspiracy theories and speculation. The judge's eyes snapped to him. Mr. Caldwell, sit down before you say something you'll regret. For the first time since the trial began, the prosecutor didn't argue. Grant was wheeled out of the courtroom, his body barely moving, his face still twisted in pain, and with him, the last hope of stopping this case from unraveling completely. The hospital smelled sterile and cold, the air thick with antiseptic and the faint beeping of machines. Emily and Robert stood in silence, watching through the glass window of the ICU as William Grant lay in the hospital bed, wires attached to his arms, a heart monitor beeping steadily. His condition had stabilized, barely. A police officer stood by his bedside, waiting. Robert folded his arms. If he dies, this all goes away. Emily swallowed hard, her hands tightening into fists. If he lives, he talks. And Grant did. 3 hours later, when he was stable enough to speak, the police escorted Robert and Emily inside. The man who once walked into the courtroom with an air of arrogance and power now looked hollow. His eyes, dark and sunken, flickered with something between exhaustion and defeat. Bennett! His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. He was never supposed to be in this. Emily's pulse quickened. She leaned forward, her voice low. Then who was? Grant's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His fingers trembled as he reached up, rubbing at his temples like the weight of his own words was crushing him. They came to me, he muttered, years ago, promised funding for the charity, expansion, protection from audits. He let out a hollow laugh. Didn't realize what I was signing up for. Robert's eyes narrowed. Who? Grant hesitated. His lips parted as if to speak. Then he stopped. He stared at them for a long moment, something flickering behind his expression. Then he let out a slow, exhaled breath. You're asking the wrong question. Emily frowned. What? Grant's eyes locked onto hers. It's not who. His voice dropped, barely above a whisper. It's how the courtroom was silent. A suffocating, unrelenting silence that wrapped around every person in the room like a vice. The judge sat still, her fingers laced together, her gaze fixed on the man standing before her. Prosecutor Caldwell. His face, once brimming with arrogance, was now ashen, his fingers twitching at his sides. The judge leaned forward, her voice low but sharp as a blade. You have 10 seconds, she said, each word deliberate. 10 seconds to explain yourself before I hold you in contempt. A bead of sweat slid down Caldwell's temple. His jaw tightened, his lips parting slightly, as if words were about to come out. But nothing did. There was no explanation, no defense, just silence. The weight of it pressed down on him like a collapsing building, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Emily could see it. The moment he realized it was over. The judge nodded slowly. That's what I thought. She turned her gaze toward the gallery, toward Mark Bennett, who had been fighting for his freedom since the moment this trial began. The gavel slammed down. This case is hereby dismissed. All charges against Mark Bennett are dropped. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, shouts, a rush of motion as the weight of the decision hit like a tidal wave. Mark Bennett collapsed into his chair, his hands covering his face. A sharp inhale, one that shook as if his body wasn't sure how to react to the sudden weight being lifted from his shoulders. His attorney gripped his arm, speaking to him in a hushed, urgent tone, but Mark wasn't listening, because his eyes, red-rimmed and stunned beyond words, were locked onto Emily. She stood near the back of the room, motionless, her breath still catching up with her. Slowly, he rose to his feet. The noise around them blurred into a distant hum as he made his way toward her. When he finally reached her, he paused, his expression one of absolute disbelief. Then, He smiled. You saved my life. Emily swallowed past the lump in her throat. You deserved the truth. Mark let out a breath, a real one this time, a free man's breath. He turned, walking toward the doors that led to a new life, one not defined by a crime he never committed. And as he stepped into the light outside the courtroom, Emily exhaled. The fight was over. But somewhere, in the shadows of the city, the people who tried to bury the truth were watching. And Emily knew this was only the beginning. Annai. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. A cold shiver ran down Emily's spine. This wasn't just about Grant. It never had been. It was bigger, much bigger. A network, an entire system, laundering billions through charities, and they had just ripped open the first layer. The night was unnervingly quiet. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone, its screen dimly glowing in the darkened room. The exhaustion in her bones was heavy, but her mind refused to rest. Everything was supposed to be over. Mark was free. The truth had won. So why did it still feel like something was lurking just beyond her reach? Then, a vibration. Her phone buzzed, the sudden noise cutting through the silence like a knife. She hesitated before flipping the screen over. One new message. The sender. Unknown number. Her pulse quickened. She tapped the notification. You won this time, but the game isn't over. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her grip on the phone tightened, her fingers hovering over the screen. Then, without hesitation, she deleted the message. She stood, walking toward the window, pressing her palm lightly against the cold glass. The street below was quiet. The car, the one that had been parked beneath the flickering street lamp for nights on end, was gone. She should have felt relief. Instead, a deep unease settled in her chest. Because this wasn't victory. Not really. She had pulled back the curtain, exposed the corruption hiding in plain sight. But whoever had sent that message, they weren't afraid. They were waiting. Emily let the curtain fall back into place, inhaled slowly, and stepped away from the window. Whatever was coming next, she'd be ready. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more intense, real-life courtroom dramas. What would you have done in Emily's place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, the truth always finds a way out. But at what cost? Stay tuned for more.